Welcome, everyone. I'm James Brooks, president of SAR, and we're beginning our 105th year of trying to understand and communicate the human experience in the past, in the present, and perhaps in the future. And what's good about our mission is it's probably impossible to fulfill, so we'll be here another 100 years with any luck. There's a couple of announcements I need to make before we introduce this year's class of fellows. One, if you could silence your cell phones, that would be appreciated by all. And my HR director this morning reminded me that at least once a year I'm supposed to point out that there are 2 exits from this room in case it should suddenly burst into flame as a consequence of the intellectual power that is now, the exit behind you, of course, as in most airplanes, is the closest one to you. However, if you wish to leap over these tables, unlock, unbolt our medieval door, you too will be able to escape out the front. I want to especially thank, we've got a great house. We have, I think, some visitors from the Santa Fe Institute who have come down along with Linda Cordell. We have several of our Board of Managers members with us who have played a critical role in the history of the school, and especially over the last few years, as you'll hear, we've had some very good fortune. The first thing you'll notice, especially you old-timers, about this year's class is that it's rather large. And that's by design, it's not by accident, and it reflects a series of very fortuitous funding opportunities that have come through for us, even during some very difficult times. And we're delighted we have new fellows with us today. Let's see, here we got our second year Campbell fellow with us. We have NEH fellow with us. We have a Luce fellow with us. You'll be hearing from everybody. Ann Ray is in its 3rd year. But as I reflected on the size of this class, I thought back 11 years to my own class when I came in as a resident scholar 11 years ago. And some of you even remember my being here. I made a big impression. We won't put a value on that one way or another. But I think when we did this event 11 years ago, there were 6 of us sitting here, and this year we have 13. So you can kind of have a sense of the way we've grown the school. And there are several factors that account for this. One, we have an extraordinarily talented pool of staff and faculty at SAR who have taken the lead in crafting new initiatives that speak to issues at once urgent in their timeliness and profound in their timelessness. We have trustees who have seen the school as an indispensable safe haven, especially as the research agenda for public universities comes under fire, both from legislators and those tuition-paying parents. Our trustees really stepped up over the last few years and said, places like SAR are ever more urgently needed today than they even were a decade or 2 or 3 ago. And I want to thank those of you who are with us and those trustees who are elsewhere for helping us to do that. This place is a community for research, reflection, conversation, and creativity like few others. We've also found an increasing pool of donors and foundations who discover in 104 years of high performance that we actually exhibit some evidence of faithful stewardship of philanthropic resources. We try to spend your money very, very well. And finally, we've worked very hard and we've had some very, very good fortune. Many things do remain the same here at our campus at 60 Garcia Street. From formal colloquial discussions to informal exchanges over a game of billiards, artists and scholars engage in an exchange of ideas that have enriched human society for thousands of years. Year upon year, these exchanges ultimately find expression in particular forms. An essay here, a monograph, a painting, a weaving. What sets SAR apart, I think, from many of our peers is what we call the peculiar alchemy that unfolds here each year, where we gather exceptional people from widely different academic, artistic, and cultural roots to meet in a single community. And that community is what you will now meet yourselves. So I think what we'll do is we'll come down the line here, beginning with Amy Garza, and you'll all get to hear a short synopsis of what our folks are up to. So let's welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Garza. I'm actually a native of Santa Fe, graduate of Santa Fe High School and New Mexico State University. I'm currently working on my dissertation project out of University of California at Santa Cruz. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my dissertation project is about the concept of the sanctuary city. Right now, we are in the battle to save driver's licenses, as you know. And New Mexico has historically been a place that has very progressive ideas about immigration and integration of immigrants. But currently we've had an influx of Mexican migration to northern New Mexico, and things are starting to change. Our politics, our religion, the cultural context of Santa Fe. So in looking at the idea of the sanctuary city, I'm also, as you've noticed, about Arizona, Georgia, Alabama, many other cities and states have decided to go a different direction, correct? What we might think of an anti-sanctuary city, a place that rejects and also discriminates against immigrants. But Santa Fe is unique in this regard that we have policies that protect immigrants from discrimination, deportation, wage theft, also racial profiling, and these are policies that help all of us, that actually help all New Mexicans. But besides this legislative and law kind of situation, the sanctuary city is also a religious concept. And so I take that seriously in my work, and I'm currently looking at the types of sanctuaries that migrants create for themselves. As you may know, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church has become the immigrant church. And in that immigrant church is the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, Renovación Carismática, which is a movement that's coming out of northern Mexico. It's sort of a response to drug cartel violence and the poverty that's striking northern Mexico. As people try to deal with this situation, they've turned to charismatic religiosity, and these movements are coming to New Mexico. The hub right now is at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, where you can find on Tuesday nights families, hundreds of people, about 100 people, coming to dance and praise to cumbia beats, and they've really revitalized the church in many ways. So looking at the translocal movement of the Renovación Carismática as an immigrant sanctuary, an immigrant hub, and also how it ties into the political realm of immigration rights, the work of Somos un Pueblo Unido, and also tracing these policies back to Tony Anaya's Sanctuary Declaration in 1986, which was a time when Central Americans were fleeing the wars and civil strife in Central America, and that's kind of the origin point of local immigration policy activism that we're seeing today. And so I do look at New Mexico's involvement in the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, and that's kind of the historical foundation of this project. So 3 scenes of representation: the history of the sanctuary movement in New Mexico, the work of Somos un Pueblo Unido, and the immigrant rights campaigns going on right now, and Renovación Carismática sums up the 3 phases of my dissertation project. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Kitty Corbett. I'm a visiting research associate, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm glad you're here. I think all of us are so grateful for this opportunity and are really, really excited about it. We also like Santa Fe and are looking forward to doing some comparative research on red and green chili. I'm going to be working on a book as a co-author with Craig Janes, who's over there second to last in the lineup, on global health. We've tentatively entitled it Grounding Global Health. I'm a medical anthropologist. I've worked on a whole array of different topics in my career, ranging from biological and biocultural topics such as antibiotic resistance to policy issues and behavioral issues such as tobacco addiction and tobacco control. I've worked in HIV prevention. I've worked in food security more recently and a lot of community-based work. I've worked in Latin America in various countries, in Russia, a bit in Mongolia, and in Taiwan, as well as in the United States and Canada. And at this point in my career, I would say that my take on the human situation is that we're in pretty dire straits. We're in a bad place. Humans are in quite a predicament. And my interest in this book is partly to pull together some ideas and experiences, linking some of these global and globalization phenomena with ethnographic understandings and experiences, to link these in a way that's useful for students and for educated lay readers. Also, though, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to sit and let ideas simmer, see what I can come up with in terms of ideas for change, for positive change, what seems viable, what may not be, and to begin to make better sense, and perhaps a little bit more optimistic sense than I currently have. I think some of the phenomena that we need to take into account when we consider human health is not just the ideas and the communities, the infrastructure, the socioeconomic and political economic situations in which we live, but also the biological and physical settings we live in. We need to take into account the pathogens that we live with, the other species that we live with, and the habitat in terms of soil, water, air, global warming phenomena, what we're doing in terms of our care or lack thereof of the planet. And it's by framing health within a context that includes those elements as well as our understandings of more classically cultural, anthropological, and political economic understandings that we're going to be able to find ways out of this predicament that we're in. The details of this book will be forthcoming. We have about a 4-page synopsis of what we're going to do, but I would say that that's very much in process. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Wasan Argo, and I would start by expressing my gratitude to the School of Advanced Research. You can't imagine how difficult and how challenging it would be to come from Africa, from Ethiopia, for such a very rare academic opportunity. Well, maybe it may not be that difficult for people around the US, but from Africa, from Ethiopia, to have such an opportunity is really a great, great pleasure. So I should say that. And I'm working on, well, the impetus for my research came not from my head, it came from my heart. If you can make a distinction between what is in the head and what is in the heart. Well, I have been a university teacher, university lecturer for the past 17 years, and my academic background is in linguistics, applied linguistics. But this time I'm not working linguistics, I'm working on gender. because it came, from my heart and from my day-to-day experience, encounter with my students in the university throughout the 17 years. So it's my great pleasure that I could pursue what is in my heart. So now the struggle is to change what is in my heart, to make it very appealing to the head. You see, I have to touch it, an academic, it should have an academic touch, a scholarly touch, so that it would be acceptable by the wider world. That's it. And I'm working on gender and higher education with a specific title on the gender agenda in Ethiopian technology universities, because I have been in technology university offering supportive linguistic courses, language and applied linguistic courses. And institutional culture as a barrier for women's participation. So I would be looking at if Ethiopian universities, especially technical ones, are reinforcing the broader culture, societal culture that you see in the real life of people in the Ethiopian society, or are they really renovating it, changing it to the better, so that we would have better women, better people, men and women who would contribute equally to the development of their country. This is what I'm up to. And just to give you an idea of, I have some painting for SAR. This is a role of women in Ethiopia in short, as in many other traditional African societies. A woman is responsible for looking after the children, obvious, and fetching water. This is the pot. Most Ethiopian rural women get their water from the nearby. Well, it takes you hours. It's not nearby. No. Hours and hours of walking on foot to get water to the family. And she's also grounding something, food processing, is also one of the time-taking house chores that Ethiopian women are engaged in every day. So this is their role in the society. And these roles have got also their own, people have their own attitudes, their own views, their own, understanding, their own, how gender relations are perceived in the wider society as a background. And I kindly give this to SAR. So please write Ethiopia in bold. Then I would like to see if really we are changing, universities are changing this culture, and if these societal gender relations and attitudes people have about roles of boys and girls, men and women, has something to do in the universities, right? In the participation of women in the university, especially in technology. So what I have done so far, I have tried to do some intense interview with some selected university colleagues and students to know about their views and the likes. And I have done observation now, like an intentional, study-oriented observation. I have lived 17 years there. Now I'm trying to make it, unbiased, something neutral type of observation. But you can't be, in fact, value neutral, as you all know. When you are observing, you might have your own values. That's normal. So I have a clear stance that my work is advocacy-oriented, collaborative research, where I have a clear political stand towards empowering women in my society. So that's my stand, and I expect from my mentors and my exposure from the scholarly community here to develop much of the theoretical part of my work, as well as the methodological part of my work. I'll be interested in reading about gender and gender relations, gender stereotypes, gender roles, gender and socialization, gender and identity, kinds of things. And also in the theoretical input, I'd like to read about organizational cultures. How could one study organizational culture? What's the culture? And the kinds of things. And from methodological input, this is a highly qualitative approach I'm going to use, and I would like help in analyzing those data that I already have, data from interview, data from focus group, data from observation, and I have also very interesting case studies, cases that I would like to sit down, listen, read again and again, and make some connections so that, as I pointed out earlier, to make them appealing for this community of scholars. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Mccardi. My Inupiaq name is Apusuk, and that comes from my great-grandmother, my Atik, or my namesake. That's Atik in, try to say Atik, everybody. Atik, that means your namesake, the person you're named after. This was given to me by my great-aunt, Sarah Hawley. She passed away last year, unfortunately, but before she did, I got to visit with her when I first visited Alaska 14 years ago. And sat down with her, and she drew up a family tree, and she gave me my great-grandmother's Inupiaq name. My great-grandmother passed away a very long time ago, but in any case, that's how I got it. So I'm one of the 2 Anne Ray native interns, and Kelsey Podan over here is the other one. And we will be studying with Nancy Mlo, right? I'm still getting to know her, so I had to explore our lovely IHS facility this morning, so I didn't get to meet with her this morning. But in any case, I'm very excited and grateful to SAR to give me this opportunity to study collections management, to fill in the gaps in my career, which have been mainly based on programs and projects, and not necessarily the actual workings of working in a museum. And I'm also very excited to be doing my own research. My most recent museum experience was as a museum assistant / assistant curator at the Alaska Heritage Museum at Wells Fargo in Anchorage, Alaska. I've also worked at the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, the British Museum, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada, where I'm originally from. These experiences that I've had, which I said were mainly programmatic and project-based, plus my interest in traditional Inupiaq stories, have led to my desire to return to school and get my PhD to become a curator. And so we will be working on papers, Kelsey and I, and we'll be presenting them next spring sometime at a colloquium. I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about my interest, just so you can understand why I'm studying this. My interest in traditional Inupiaq stories came from when I was a very little girl, and my father read stories from around the world to my brother and I when we were kids. Again, I grew up in Toronto, Canada. That's a very cosmopolitan place. It has people from all over the world. During my undergraduate degree in Oberlin, I had a study away opportunity to go to Alaska. I went to UAF. And then also, so during that experience and then after my degree, I began my journey of connection and discovery, connection to my family and discovery that I'm still on today. And I think I'm going to be on for the rest of my life. I thought as a young person that I'd have this neat little package and then I'd be done and then I'd get to do other things, but you know, it still continues. During this experience, my greatest joy was to listen to the elders tell stories. You know how, no offense to academic lectures, but you have academic lectures. And you have stories. And you know how when you listen to an academic lecture, you have a certain way of listening to it, and you're taking notes in your mind and, you know, saying, and, you know, my dad's a professor. I'm very interested in those as well. But when you listen to a story, your mind kind of switches, and you, I don't really know how to explain it, but you all know, you've listened to stories. You kind of sit back, your mind relaxes in some way, and you sit back. And then throughout your life, if you hear the same story, you might learn different things. Depending on whether or not you're a young kid, you might, you know, not understand certain things and take certain lessons out of it, as opposed to when you get a lot older, when you've had life experience and you can kind of compare. So all Indigenous peoples have had oral histories in their lifetimes. Everybody here was, in their family, Indigenous at one point. These stories tell you several things. They give you rules of behavior. They keep track of important events and significant people who did great things. One of the things that you know, I came across, I was doing some transcription of oral history interviews, was about a great starvation that happened about 100 years ago in the Dena'ina Athabascan region. And these people that I was transcribing, they kept talking about it, and it was like a reminder, just always be prepared, always store your food, because you never know when nature might kind of rear its head, and then all of a sudden you're without the resource that you were looking for. It can also tell you who you're related to, which is very important, because in a time when it was about life and death, you know, and so your connections with your family are very, very important. These are people you can rely on, people you can go to. So there are stories of starvation where a whole village died, except for maybe a couple of people. So if you know your relatives, you know who you can go to and you're safe. Back then, I've heard that if you weren't related as a family, you were considered an enemy, possible enemy. So these connections are very important. So the fact that I know my Inupiaq name, I know my connections, this is very, very important in Inupiaq society. It can also, as I was just saying, tell you, give you places and people, or tell you about places and people to avoid or trust. There's a lot of information in stories, a lot more than you might think. And I've been told that to use the word narrative because that is more, say, academically, I don't know, sounds better, right? But, I mean, stories, to me it doesn't matter. Stories mean a lot to me. I don't really have time. I had a very short story I was going to tell you, but I think there's a lot of people that need to speak, so I'll just move along. Maybe towards the end I'll tell some stories, because at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, that was my job, actually. I had to memorize some stories, and then when my great-aunt passed away this last summer, I went up to visit the family. I brought my mother up for the first time. She'd never been to Kivalina. And I was visiting with some relatives at the end of the village, and they were telling me some stories from the local area, which in itself is so cool because, you know, these stories actually happened here on this land, you know. Anyway, it's very cool, and I felt obligated to share, to give back, because it's all about sharing, right? So I told a couple of stories that I had memorized as a MC storyteller, and you could just see the appreciation and the understanding and the respect, and it was like my journey had come full circle from when I got to Alaska 14 years ago. And I'll never forget that. It's just an incredible experience. And as I was getting up to leave with my mother, I heard one of these, my relatives say, storyteller, you know, and that was just stopped me in my tracks. I said, what did you say? They said, storyteller. And that's just such an honor. I mean, it really is such an honor that my relatives, who I grew up away from in Toronto, Canada, would tell me that I'm a storyteller. So in any case, these are the things that I want to explore in my paper. And it's going to be the connection between these stories and museum collections. So the collection that I was working with, there are a lot of Alaska Native objects. I may compare these stories to other ones, just to see, you know, if you have a story and then there's this object that somehow fits in, just to see what happens there. So anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julie Wise, and I'm the Weatherhead Fellow for this year. And I'm an assistant professor of international studies at California State University. I'm a historian by training. And just per what James Brooks was saying earlier, California State University is one of these wonderful places with wonderful faculty and wonderful students. And there was just an op-ed in the LA Times last month saying that we should all give up our research agendas and just focus on teaching. So to that end, this safe haven, as James Brooke indicated, is unbelievably valuable for all the reasons that he articulated. So this will be the place where I will be finishing my first book, which I've so far titled Corazón de Dixie, Migration and the Struggle for Rights in the U.S. South and Mexico, from 1910 to 2010. And Santa Fe is going to be an interesting place for me to complete the writing of this book. Of course, we're here in the historical borderlands of the United States and Mexico. And understandably, most historians of Mexican immigration and Mexican Americans have focused their studies here in the southwestern United States. But my research takes the field into a new direction. And it took its beginning, its inspiration, from the headlines that some may recall right after the 2000 census results came out, when the big story out of that census was the incredible Latino population growth in the American South. At that time, the headlines were reporting that places like North Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas were experiencing 3, 4, 5, 600% increase in Latino population in just 10 years. And at the time, that was portrayed as a new phenomenon, something novel, nuevo, but my research shows that, in fact, it is not. My book is set up as a series of case studies of Mexican migration to the American South spanning the period of 1910 to 2010. And in each case study, I examine Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans' struggle for rights in their new Southern environments. So I begin with a case study of New Orleans during and after the Mexican Revolution, about 1910 through the early 30s, and the Mexican immigrants that moved there. And then I move on to Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta, called by one scholar the most southern place on earth, where Mexican immigrants moved in the 20s and 30s to sharecrop alongside African Americans and poor whites. I then, for the next case study, turned to Arkansas from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where tens of thousands of Mexican men went on contracts to pick cotton. And then I move on to the roots of the current boom in Mexican immigrant and Latino population in the South. I look at the Mexicans and Mexican Americans who became migrant laborers in the rural South's agricultural areas in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I focus there on Georgia. And then finally, I end my book with a case study of the last 20 years, looking at what I believe is a very significant development, which is the incredible explosion of Mexican immigrant population in metropolitan areas, specifically suburbs. And for that case study, I look at Charlotte, North Carolina. So the stories that I tell in this book, I think, in addition to recovering this history that had been lost, I think they really point to the importance of taking a cross-border approach when studying race and ethnicity. And I'll just tell one story to illustrate that. I went in, as a part of my research, to the Mississippi State Archives in Jackson. And I was looking through some old newspapers, and an archivist came up to me. And he said, "Excuse me, but I heard that you're here researching Mexican immigration to the Mississippi Delta." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I was born and raised in the Mississippi Delta. I lived there for 40 years. And I said, "Oh, wonderful." And he said, "We had no Mexicans. There were never any Mexicans in the Mississippi Delta until about 10 years ago. So you can save your time and stop your research." And I, of course, at the time knew what he was saying was not correct, but I wasn't going to tell him that. But if we can flash then to Mexico City, where I visited the archives of the Mexican foreign relations, of the Mexican consulates that were all over the United States doing work with Mexican immigrants, protecting them while they were abroad. In Mexico City, I found literally thousands of documents, not only about the Mexican immigrants that were in Mississippi, that the gentleman in Mississippi had not seen or known about, believed had not existed, but also about the whole span of Mexican immigration history to the South. And just to provide one tiny example from these thousands of documents, I learned so many stories, such as a story in which Mexican bureaucrats traveled to Arkansas in the 50s and conducted a secret shopper experiment where they would take a Mexican migrant laborer, they were all men, dress him in nice clothes and send him to whites-only restaurants and stores to see how many of them would let him in or not. And if too many wouldn't let him in, then they would file a report with the U.S. Department of Labor and try to pull all of the immigrants laborers from that part of Arkansas, which of course was so threatening to the farmers who were counting on that labor, that the farmers started passing pro-immigrant ordinances. We've heard about all the anti, basically saying if your store discriminates against Mexicans in your whites-only store, you're going to be fined X, Y, and Z because we risk losing all of our labor if the Mexican government finds out about it. So these are the types of stories that could be uncovered through doing research on both sides of the border. And those are the types of stories that I hope to tell in my book and that I hope to flesh out over the coming year. So thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Kelsey Podan. I'm from Juneau, Alaska, and I'm one of the Anne Ray interns. My mother is Athabascan, and that is the native group from the interior of Alaska. And we have our cousins, the Navajo and the Apache, down here in the Southwest. So this is really interesting for me because I can see a lot of similarities. Hopefully, I'll be taking a look at some of those this year with my research. But it's a wonderful opportunity to be down here. I'm so excited to be able to learn everything I've always wanted to learn about museums. Yesterday, the registrar, Jennifer, gave me some books, and it was finally just like holding the Bible of museum studies. I was really excited because these are things that I've been wanting to learn, but I just haven't really known how to get at. I haven't known how to access this information. Here it was. And she's like, no, you don't have to do this. You don't have to read it all tonight. I was like, oh, okay. She's like, just read it when you're tired of doing other things. All right. So I'm so happy to be back in an academic environment. It's wonderful. I had a wonderful hike this morning with Nancy, and we talked all about graduate school, studies, what I might want to go into. My research is certainly not as advanced as everyone else here, so I'll be working on this year, developing things that I'll want to study later on. One of my ideas that I've been developing has been to study Athabascan beadwork. And it's something it's definitely not a static art form by any means. I have aunties and cousins who will bead iPod cases or cell phone holders. For my own graduation from college, I wore a stole that one aunt spent forever making. I don't know how long, but they're marks of distinction, they're artwork that we carry with us, and I think that the development of this art form really says a lot about our culture, our arts, and our recent history. Glass beads aren't indigenous to Alaska by any means. They were brought with the Russians, and Athabascans actually adopted glass beads before they even met the Russians. They came in as trade beads. They traded with the Inupiaq and the other Eskimo peoples, and they also came up from the Aleut as well. So I think that could be interesting to look at this year. So the Athabascans, they did get smallpox, they got measles, and they also got these beads. So what did they think when they finally met the Russians that brought these things over? It's like, this is a cherished art form now, but it also came with colonialism. So that can be something that's very interesting to look at. And it's just, another thing I would like to look at is just why we carry our beadwork with us. It's not something that belongs in a cupboard. It's not a painting that belongs on the wall. Athabascans were nomadic people, so we carried our artwork with us. Beading was a sign of distinction. I had a great-grandfather who was a chief, and he had a beaded necklace. And when he died, no one touched it because it was so important. They buried it with him. I mean, this was made generations ago. It would probably be very valuable today, but people were afraid of it. They were afraid of what this necklace meant because he was a chief. He was important. If you picked up this necklace, you owed something. You had a responsibility to your people. So they buried it with him, and now who knows where it is. And today at graduations and wedding ceremonies, we'll wear beaded work that our relatives have made for us, and it's a mark of distinction. So I'd like to look at that transference of responsibility, of distinction through artwork. And it's a multifaceted project, and I cannot wait for my mentors and peers and fellow interns to help me narrow it down and figure out how to make it a concise and real research project. But I'd like to thank everyone here at SAR again, and yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Nancy Marie Mlo. I'm an associate professor of art history and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm very honored to be this year's Anne Ray Fellow and to work with Kelsey and with Jennifer all year. I very much believe in mentorship, and I thought I might follow James just a little bit, giving a little background or bio. I came to Santa Fe, it's almost 30 years ago, as a student at the Institute of American Indian Arts in their Museum Studies program. I lived at the youth hostel, and I washed dishes at the Natural Cafe, and I walked across the street to my classes. So it's been quite a journey for me, and I think very significant that I was able to return this year and to be able to pursue the issues that I care most about. And generally, it's about Native arts and representation. I was fortunate to receive a Ford Fellowship at the University of Wisconsin, in which I started a project called American Indian Curatorial Practice. And the first installation of that was State of the Field, just to see where are we in the field. And one of the things that we came out of that colloquium with was describing what is indigenous curation. And I would describe indigenous curation as being long-term, mutually meaningful, reciprocal, and with mentorship. And I think surprisingly, and maybe I shouldn't even say surprisingly, but coming full circle and being back at SAR as an Anne Ray Fellow, I see that fellowship as enacting indigenous curatorial methodologies, and particularly the mentorship part of it. I think that's just really key, because we're in a point in the development of scholarship for American Indian arts where we really are starting to be able to assess how far we've gone and where we need to go. And there are a lot of issues involved still. We seem to run around the same track, tradition or modern, artist first or native. These are problems that I've seen over the past 30 years that I really want to try to tackle and move beyond. And I think mentorship and this long-term type of research is a part of that. I'm also, I should say, a Georgia O'Keeffe Fellow this year, and this has been a very exciting development. Many of you might have followed the politics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison this past spring. We had our own revolution at the Capitol. And consequently, I'm coming without a sabbatical without any subvention. And I was very fortunate to receive a yes from SAR and a yes from the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center. And so I'm actually going to be sharing that internship, 6 months here and 6 months at Georgia O'Keeffe, working on a project that's very dear to my heart that does have all of those indigenous curatorial methodologies, kinds of markers. And the project is the Horace Poolaw Photography Project. Now, this is slated to be an exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian in spring of 2014, New York City. Horace Poolaw is a phenomenal photographer. He is a Kiowa from Oklahoma. Now, my tribal background, I'm a Fort Sill, Chiricahua, Warm Springs Apache tribe member. It's a long description, I know. Chiricahua Apache. We're the ones that are known by the fighters Geronimo, Mangus, Cochise. We're also known for our legacy of imprisonment. Our tribe is the tribe that suffered 28 years of imprisonment in the United States. My grandfather, who was still alive when I received my PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University in 1993, he was born a prisoner of war. He stayed that way until he was in his 20s. My tribal chairwoman, Mildred Cleghorn, who wrote all those letters to get me through grad school, she was born a prisoner of war here. So for us, it's a very recent history. So I come from the Southern Plains, and many of you, if you've heard of the KCAs, it stands for the Kiowas, the Comanches, and the Apaches. So our part of America is intertwined. We're intertwined by the history of Fort Sill, we're intertwined by the history of imprisonment, and we're intertwined by, of course, the legacy of colonialism in America. Now, here's Horace Poolaw, this fantastic photographer who from the time he was a teenager up until the time he could no longer photograph, collected, he had his legacy is 2,000 images. Now, most of those are all negatives. So for whatever reasons, he didn't print many of his photographs. His daughter, Linda Poolaw, took the images in the 1980s to Stanford, where I was a student. Linda is actually an aunt by marriage.
Out in the plains of Oklahoma, you know, everyone's got to be cousins. There's an intermarriage there. And she saw some of his images for the first time, and I was fortunate to be there and be a part of that process. She took those images back to rural Oklahoma with Stanford students. They identified the images, and it became a traveling exhibition. Now, the selection of those images was based only upon what the undergraduates were interested in, and so they tended to be what I call the contrast picture. And the contrast picture is actually one of my theoretical concerns when I'm going to be pursuing the curatorial project for the exhibit in New York City. The contrast picture is built upon the legacy of the boarding school. Many of you are probably familiar with the before and after. You know, Native kids who are in their traditional outfits, and then they're scrubbed up, they're shaved, and they're in what looks like really uncomfortable clothing. And somehow that was to represent this transformation of Native people. The contrast picture that was also used as a source of humor, and I draw upon the scholarship of Phil Deloria and others who talk about natives in unexpected places. The big motive for me is typically Geronimo in the Cadillac. Most people laugh at that image. They think it's really funny, but you know, why wouldn't Geronimo be in a Cadillac? You know, why is modernity so foreign from the Native experience? And that idea of modernity in Native context is really what I want to try to pull out. So just briefly, because there are other speakers, I'm interested not only in the content of these photographs, which have fantastic things. There's Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. There's John Collier is in the photographs, Jim Thorpe. I mean, just amazing things. The representations of the Craterville Indian Festival, the Medicine Lodge Treaty Festival, the Anadarko Indian Exposition, Native people consciously dressing and performing Indianness, which is fascinating enough in itself. But then there's also this idea of how Horace chooses to take those photographs. And even with the Smithsonian now, there's a debate about, was he a documentary photographer or was he an artist? And in my beginning phases of talking with him about the exhibit, typically because I just wanted the show so badly, I've worked with his collection for 20 years now, 20 years. I would say, well, which one do you think he is? You know? But now that we have the exhibit, I get to do more. But you know, he actually had this very aesthetic idea. I was talking with David Grant Noble, I'm so happy to reconnect with you, but I was talking about this monumentalness where he looks from a lower angle upwards. There are natives that become, I don't know what to say, not godlike, but something like that. You know, they're in the clouds. They're filled with dignity and poise. And if you flash back to those boarding school photographs, you see how important it is that we're claiming that dignity in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So you look at what else is going on there. We're getting the right to vote. Indian Reorganization Act is happening. We're serving in larger numbers in the military than ever before. And he's documenting this, marriages, funerals, there's a whole body of work about Native vets. And so I'm drawing from that evidence, the content, the form, and I'm also looking at how we're going to present it. You know, that endless question of, you know, was Horace Pulaw traditional or modern? You know, why do we work in that upper level register? So I'm hoping through the curation of the show that I'll be able to get to some more depth and ask some more complicated questions about Native representation. So thank you to SAR and thanks to my fellow scholars.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Mccardi. I'm a cultural anthropologist and applied linguist, and I'm on the faculty of Arizona State University. And I am very honored to be this year's National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at SAR. Like my colleagues, I want to express my deep appreciation to James Brooks and SAR for this incredible gift of time and intellectual and social community. And I also want to say thanks to all of you for coming out and giving us such a warm welcome here. It's very, very heartwarming to see so many people here interested in the work that we'll be doing this year. I want to begin with a tiny excerpt from a recent interview that I conducted with an O'odham middle school student. And she said, I just want to learn my cultural language when I asked her whether knowing her tribal language was important. It's a big, important part of my life if I'm going to be a native, she added. So my project grows out of more than 30 years of work with indigenous communities in North America, Latin America, Australasia, the Pacific, on language education. And when I first began that work in a very small reservation interior community on the Navajo Nation, the problems were very different. The kids came to school speaking Navajo as their primary language, and what we were trying to do was find meaningful ways to incorporate their native language and culture in the curriculum while they were acquiring English as a second language. Today, the situation is just about reversed. Those same children that were in the school that I worked in 30 years ago, all bilinguals, thanks to bilingual schooling, are raising their own children as English monolinguals. And this is one instance of a massive language shift going on worldwide, as, quote, smaller languages, marginalized languages are abandoned in favor of so-called world languages. Just to give you a sense, a recent UNESCO panel predicts that by century's end, 90% of humankind's languages will no longer be spoken. The National Geographic Society estimates that every 2 weeks a language dies as its last speaker passes away. And of all of these forfeited languages, the majority will be indigenous languages. So these are very sobering facts. The loss of even a single language is an inestimable loss of human intellectual capital. But underneath the statistics are real people and real lives caught up in the social, economic, and political forces that create the shift in the first place. And this is where my passion lies. I, too, identify myself as an activist anthropologist, and it's the people issues surrounding language that really drive the project that I'll be working on here at SAR. Surprisingly little scholarly attention has been paid to youth subjectivities around language endangerment and reclamation. On the one hand, youth are considered to be kind of the last line of defense in their community's cultural and linguistic continuity. On the other hand, they're very likely to have incomplete linguistic knowledge. Part of the reason it's been alluded to with the boarding school experience and parents not wanting their children to experience the humiliation and pain and suffering that they went through for speaking their mother tongue in school. And youth are not immune from the larger racializing discourses that stigmatize their heritage language as backward and as lacking mobility in the globalizing world economy. So over the past 7 years, I've had the opportunity to hold deep conversations, ethnographic interviews, with about 70 indigenous youth around language issues, and those youth aged about 9 to 21. I've also spent considerable time in their communities documenting ethnographically their language practices. So just let me introduce you briefly to a few of these young people. There was the middle school student that I quoted at the beginning who yearned for what she called her cultural language, and that gives title to my project. There was another middle school student who, though he lacked any ability in his indigenous language of his community, repeatedly referred to it as my blood language. And there was Jonathan, probably one of the most intense and rich interviews I have ever conducted in my life, and I have conducted hundreds and hundreds of ethnographic interviews. Jonathan was a 16-year-old ninth grader who showed up at the interview in full black Gothic attire, purple hair, and wearing contact lenses that mimicked the amber eyes of a cat. Jonathan, who is Navajo, spoke of what he called the long walk syndrome, the, quote, inherited trauma that lead youth, and these are his words, to forsake who you are, to give up learning Navajo in order to accommodate the mainstream life. Yet Jonathan spoke fluent Navajo. It was his first language. It only came out midway through a 2.5-hour interview that this was indeed his first language. And he insisted that it, quote, helps not lose the identity of who I am, of where I come from. That's all linked with survival, he said. So my project is what I'm calling a tender excavation of these deeply felt youth desires, an effort to listen to youth with what Nietzsche called ears to hear, their narratives and counter-narratives around language. I'm hoping in that activist stance that this is also going to be a story that is empowering to those youth and their communities. And in that, with that goal in mind, I borrow from Simon Ortiz's Fight Back Poetics, and in particular his notion of cultural continuance. Languages do not die of their own accord. They're pushed out of those intimate spaces between parent and child, grandparent and grandchild, by larger policies and forces of coercion and assimilation. And we can see that very, very blatantly in our own political climate of English only in the United States. That's also linked to issues of immigration that are being looked at by my colleagues here at SAR. So language loss is not merely or even primarily a linguistic issue, but it's a larger fight for self-determination, for what Simon Ortiz calls cultural continuance, a determined yet hopeful struggle to sustain living cultural communities. As Jonathan reflected when I asked him if he thought Dene, Navajo people, would be speaking Navajo 40 years from now, I have hope, he said, hope that we can continue carrying on longer who we are as a people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is John Martin. I'm an emeritus professor from Arizona State University, where I retired 3 years ago. I did my dissertation here in the Southwest. And in fact, I came here to do it in 1963. And I've been around a long time, walking through the halls of this place. I see pictures of my students who have been fellows here, which is a kind of an odd feeling. But in this small community that I went to in 1963, I learned a lot. They taught me a great deal about being human. They also provided me with ideas that were going to guide my work throughout my life. Among those things which I encountered there was their struggles with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. As you all know, living in the Southwest, type 2 diabetes is a scourge among Native Americans. The highest rates in the world are to be found here, among the Akamelolatum outside of Phoenix and other tribes. I began to get interested in this at their request, and I began to study and to read and learn something about the endocrinology of it, metabolism, things of that order. And in the course of that, and also doing lots of work on its epidemiology. And one of the things that I came to lose faith in was the model of type 2 diabetes being the result of basically a strong genetic load which predisposes you to insulin resistance if you have a normal diet and aren't suffering all the time from starvation. And that struck me as odd, particularly given what the epidemiology was. Like, there are people here who are Athabascans. The Athabascans in the southern part of the country have terrible type 2 diabetes, like with the southern reservations. Whereas in Alaska and in Canada, there are Athabascan tribes in which we found that 6/10 of the population had type 2 diabetes. Whereas here, you find rates of 20%, 30%, things of that order. So I really began to question that. And I began to learn about work being done mainly in Europe, India, and in Europe within England and the Low Countries, where it was featured lately in a cover article in Time magazine. It's called The Fetal Origins Approach or Model of Type 2 Diabetes. I became interested in that. The basic idea is that women in pregnancy create situations or are led into situations where they're hyperglycemic in pregnancy. And this results in offspring with changed insulin secretion, with changed glucose secretion, reduced glycogen, a whole host of changes which presupposes them to type 2 diabetes. If those people get to eat, they're the ones that get type 2 diabetes. Now the pathway with Native Americans, for many of them, and with this tribe that I'm talking about, it was preceded by massive starvation around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And 40% of that tribe was wiped out in that time, both from malnutrition and from a series of really terrific epidemics, measles and something they called lung fever in those days. And what was interesting about that is that when you take laboratory animals and you starve the females during pregnancy for protein, they produce offspring that have impaired insulin secretory capacity. And when those offspring mature, they are prone to get diabetes if they're overfed and if the females become pregnant. In pregnancy, those of you who've had children, you know that in the last trimester, your tummy grows like mad. And it's because the glucose is flowing across the placenta and going to the fetus and fueling its growth. Well, what happens when you have impaired insulin secretory capacity, you cannot, like a normal woman, respond to your increasing insulin resistance that comes with your pregnancy and moderate that, and you become hyperglycemic in pregnancy. You have a diabetic pregnancy, and that then does that to your children. And that was the initial step in the pathway to diabetes among many Native Americans who suffered this disease. The implication of that research is that we went 5 generations. We covered our lab animals through 5 generations, and then we took these females, which were insulin resistant, some of them were obese, hyperglycemic in pregnancy, and during their pregnancies, we cut back on their caloric intake by chopping down on their carbohydrates, but otherwise we gave them a nutritionally balanced chow. And they produced normal offspring. The implication being that if you can control the woman's metabolism in pregnancy, you can break the sequence of events through time. I'm not here to talk to you about that. I mean, except to say that it's within the power of Native Americans, particularly since gaming came, to devise their own public health programs, focusing on controlling the metabolism of their pregnant young women and breaking the sequence, which is a scourge. What I am here to do, though, is to talk about something which was related to those terrible epidemics that those people had, and that is I discovered the sex ratio in this population. The sex ratio is where it's basically the percentage of the population which is male or the percentage which is female. The normal one that you see is like, in the United States, it's 105. And what that simply means is that for every 100 women or females in that birth, it would be 100 female births, there's 105 male births. That's sort of the record for our national population. And in Europe, not all people have that same ratio. And this population had a ratio of 124 when I got there. And when I first looked at their data. And around the turn of the century, from 1896 to 1906, the sex ratio of birth was 140 males for every 100 females. And as those people matured, you can imagine what happened. The men were up against a lot of competition. And the lesser men like me, didn't marry until late. And as a byproduct of that, there were very long generational intervals between men and their children. You can also imagine a situation if I'm a guy 30 and I'm looking for a wife, and I haven't got one yet because I don't have much land, I don't have any horses. My dad was, didn't care for me. But I have a sister, and like all the little girls were married by age 15. And so one gets a situation where the difference between a man and his children and his sister and her children is a big difference. And that then is going to skew the difference in ages between cousins on one side is against the other side, so that the female's children are going to be older than her brother's children, much older. And that's going to change all kinds of social relations between related folks and has implications for kinship. So I explored that, looking at data from Australia, from South America, from other tribes, and I started to look at it in Africa. And it has all kinds of consequences for succession. Like if your dad, as in this population, has his first son at age 32, and he dies on average at 55, that's only the oldest son is going to be in a position to succeed and take over his statuses and activities. And so all of that filled my head with ideas, and I began to wonder, well, what would account for these sex ratio differences? And so I began looking at African data to see if I could find some more things. And that is what I'm working on here. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about that. Within Africa, there's been a lot of work on sex ratio variation. Generally, the most common thing you hear is that sex ratios are low in Africa, particularly in southern Africa, like 103 males for every 100 females at birth. Some people have argued that that is genetic, and it's another case of racialization, like it is with Okay, all right. Okay, what I found is that you get a pattern where the sex ratio of birth varies there with where women are living or who they're living with. If you are a woman and you're living with other women, as you do in extended family systems who are of fertile age, you have a lower sex ratio among your children than if you live alone. This is a basic finding. Moreover, one of the interesting things is that if you look at women who are living alone, the sex ratio among their births declines as they approach age 30, but at age 30 it suddenly jumps up to 130. Whereas women who live with other women, the sex ratio declines from the beginning, from 15 all the way through age 49. And what I'm working on now is looking in a little more detail at this and trying to understand how that difference occurs, why it is where women live with other women, the sex ratio declines all the way, and in others, where they live alone, it declines till you're 30, and then it pops up to 130. And so that is what I'm going to be working on here.
Good afternoon. My name is Franklin Peters. I come from the Pueblo of Acoma. And I'm here on the King Native Artist Fellow. What I'm going to be doing here at SAR is my pottery. And so, kind of nervous. But that's what I do. I do it for a living, and I enjoy doing it. And I'm happy to, have you guys all come to the studio and, sit there and watch me build pots. So, but thank you.
Greetings. My name is Marge Bruschack. I'm Abenaki Indian, and I'm a very long way from home. I'm pleased to be here, and I too am a double fellowship recipient. I have a Ford Fellowship this year, and I was able to convince my university to give me a year off and do both of them simultaneously. I also secured a book contract, so I am here as the Catherine Lamont Fellow. I am working on a book manuscript titled Consorting with Savages, Indigenous Informants, and American Anthropologists. And what I'm looking at actually began as a result of a single question that was posed to me about 3 years ago. I was a candidate for a 5-year Canadian Research Fellowship at Memorial University in Newfoundland. It was the longest job interview I've ever been on. They flew me for 5 days all over Labrador and Newfoundland, along with my husband. They had to meet my husband as well. Every Indigenous community had to meet me, because if I was to be there as a Native person, working with Native communities, they had to know who I was, where I came from, what my politics were, and what I would do for them. Well, at one of the presentations, a very elderly fellow stood up in the back of the room, and he said, "I hear you talk about Frank Speck. Do you know him?" And I said, "Well, sir, I'm sorry, Frank Speck died before I was born." He said, "Do you know his family?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't. I know his research." He said, "Then I would like you to carry a message for me. We miss him." And I said, "How is this?" He said, "Well, when I was a young boy and Speck came to our community, and this old man was an Escapi, he said, I was the only member of our community who spoke English, and my father was his guide. And so I, as a young boy, was the intermediary for this great scientist who came to study us. And when he collected what he needed and he went back to the University of Pennsylvania, we never heard from him again. We miss him." Well, I took that question very seriously, and I took it as a personal responsibility. And when I landed at the University of Connecticut and was given the task of being coordinator of Native American Indigenous Studies, I felt it was my job to recreate those relationships that were broken so long ago by people in my profession. And I found myself in this very curious position of being Native and anthropologist, of being an older woman coming back to the university after a very long and very complex life experience of my own. And so I tried to weave all of those together. And what I discovered is that there are a series of relationships that are not well understood, that are absolutely crucial to anthropology as we know it, and to perceptions and representations of indigenous people in the present day. And those knowledges came out of these early relationships. They came out of those moments in time when specific Native individuals stepped up and said, "Welcome to our community, I will help you. You want to know something? Sit down with my grandmother, she will talk to you. You want to know how we do these things? We are delighted that you are interested." And many of those Native people never imagined that those knowledges and those things would go away and would disappear and would never come back to them. So the partnerships I'm looking at are very specific individuals, and through them I hope to create windows to understand what happened and what the legacy and resonance is of those activities. So those partnerships include Frank Speck and Gladys Tantaquidgeon. Gladys was a teenager, a Mohegan woman, when Speck came to her community, and she grew up into becoming the tribal medicine woman at the same time he grew up into becoming the famous anthropologist. But you never see that in his writings about her or about her tribe. I'm also looking at Jesse Cornplanter, Cayuga, and William Fenton. Jesse complained bitterly in his private correspondence to Fenton, which consumes a file this long at the American Philosophical Society, about how many things were taken away from the Haudenosaunee, about how often Fenton mistreated him, and yet he kept going back to him again and again because he took this relationship very seriously. I'm also looking at Arthur Parker, who we know is a Seneca anthropologist at the New York State Museum, and his cousin Emma Mead, who we never hear of. She was Abenaki and Oneida. And when Parker came into his status in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, his cousin was trying to help Haudenosaunee leaders who were dealing with questions of citizenship, Haudenosaunee people who were struggling to continue traditional ceremonies at the same time the state was trying to shut them down. Abenaki people who had gone to Hollywood to act as Indians because they looked really good. They had that Lakota phenotype. And they were struggling to get the medicines they needed out east, and Emma was providing them. But Parker wrote about none of this. And he even ditched his first wife, who happened to be an Abenaki woman, and married a young white girl because his white colleagues told him his profession would better advance if his wife was not in his way or standing at his side. And so I'm looking at these materials by examining their correspondence, which is surprisingly dense, by examining the stories that are told about these relationships in contemporary communities, and by figuring out how we can kind of go back and retrospectively examine just what was going on in those early times. And so I'm also finding, and this is part of this project as well, is that not only were anthropologists taking things, but they were also contributing to the emergence of the multi-million-dollar American Indian art market that exists today. by valuing and revaluing these things, and in some cases stealing and selling sacred objects to support their anthropological research. And I'm not just talking out of my hat here. I have very good on-the-ground evidence of which objects and where they have gone to. And so through these investigations, I hope to articulate some new protocols of encounter to highlight these early indigenous contributions and to chart potential paths for what future collaborations might look like. And by reflecting on these memories, I intend to highlight those Native people who attempted to indigenize ethnography as a reciprocal exchange rather than the cannibalizing process it became. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Craig James. I'm here from Simon Fraser University, which is the second largest public university in British Columbia. And there I'm in a faculty of health sciences, but I'm a medical anthropologist by training. And I'm here at SAR with a Henry Luce Fellowship that I'm just absolutely thrilled to have been offered. And I'll just join my colleagues in just saying how thankful I am for the precious gift of time that this fellowship has given me. Now, most of you, or many of you, probably know that the Luce Fellowship, which I believe is new at SAR, is given to scholars who study in East Asia, and where I work is Mongolia. By way of talking about my project and about what I do in Mongolia, let me just give you sort of just a very brief historical vignette. Now, the winters of 2009, 2010, as were the winters of 96, 97, 2000, 2001, were very difficult ones for Mongolia's rural population. And I should point out that the rural population of Mongolia are primarily pastoral herders, but this is not a small percentage of the population. These are not marginal populations by any stretch. It's 25% of the total population, currently comprising some 30 to 35% of gross domestic product in terms of economic output. So this is a significant population. So the summer of 2009 had been particularly dry, and so the animals did not gain enough weight. They entered the winter undernourished. The winter turned out to be a bad one. It was cold. There was a lot of snow. The animals couldn't forage. And 9 million of animals, about 20% or 1/5 of the national herd, died. And of course, what this meant is that many households, especially those with smaller numbers of animals in the wrong place at the wrong time, basically lost all of their assets, all of their livestock, and were forced to migrate to the city. And there they joined the refugees from other climate disasters from previous years. They join a growing class of marginal poor, and also contribute this group, or this particular problem, I should say, not these people, but the problem contributes to Mongolia's general growing social problems of this post-socialist era. These include increasing crime in the cities, very poor health, intransigent poverty rates of 30% or more, the worst air pollution in Asia, if not the world, as is now documented, and so forth. And so what happens in rural areas has a big impact on the whole country. So the primary research question, the one that I'm really asking here, is what's going on here? Why does this happen? Why are herders unable to cope with these climate disasters, and why are they forced into cities where they face very poor prospects and dismal lives? So there are many explanations that have been offered for this. Two are prominent. One is just simply climate change. This is just a harbinger of what's likely to come. These are climate refugees, and this is a call to arms to somehow help these people or to assist them in adapting. A second, which is popular with the World Bank and other development organizations, are that herders are engaged in unsustainable herding practices, and there's been rapid herd growth, and there's been pasture degradation. They're raising too many goats. There's all this kind of stuff. Now, some of these explanations are, to some extent, provable, and there is some logic behind them, but my research, which has spanned about 15 years now, and which has been all over the country, both rural and urban areas, points to, though, that there are other primary drivers, that these are really intermediate factors. The primary drivers include that what happened when Mongolia made the transition from a Soviet satellite state to a liberal free market economy But most specifically, what happened in rural areas was really the collapse of the state, the abandonment of rural areas by the Mongolian state. Complicating these issues is a naivete, both by outsiders as well as by the Mongolian elite, of the practices of pastoralism and what pastorals really require to be successful. There's really been a transformation of the risks that pastoralists must confront and makes them far more vulnerable than they were. Pastoralism, I should point out, has been practiced in a state-level society for 500 years, up until 1990, when they were suddenly said, you're herders, you can go on and do what you want. As Mongolians, you should know how to herd. You don't need any of our help. So really, my time here is to try and pull together the materials that I have through my research to tell this story, to really construct these explanations, in part to tell the story, but also in part to really try and inform some of the solutions, not only in Mongolia, but also elsewhere in the world where you do have pastoral populations facing, Somalia would be a good example, facing these kind of disasters, which are really anthropogenic disasters, not only climate change, but also failed development. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Linda Garo, and I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. And I'm here on the Kotzen Fellowship, also known as the Torture Fellowship, because I'm only here for 1 month. Okay, and so I already am sort of feeling a sense of regret that I'm not going to be here for longer. Now, what my project explores is how matters of health and well-being enter into the everyday lives of dual-earner, middle-class families in Los Angeles. And the data that I'm analyzing comes from an interdisciplinary research and training project that was carried out at UCLA through what's known as the Center on the Everyday Lives of Family, for short, CELF, and that's CELF with a C, okay? And this project received funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to carry out ethnographic research on how U.S. middle-class families create a home life when both parents work outside the home. And my particular involvement has been as a medical and psychological anthropologist, and I've had long-standing interests in how matters of health and illness enter into and are dealt with in everyday life in other different settings. Now, the core and very distinctive feature of this CELF project is that we have very extensive video recordings of everyday family life. So what we try and do is we try and get the sense of a week in the life of the family. And what that means is when the families wake up in the morning, we're standing outside there with our video cameras. And we have 2 video cameras and another person who sort of keeps track of where everyone is in the house. And we follow family members around as they're getting ready, as they're preparing breakfast, you know, whatever they're doing. We don't go into the bathrooms, but, you know, other than that, we're sort of there. And we stay with them until people leave to go to work and go to school. And then we come back in the afternoon, and as soon as someone gets there, and we stay with them until the children go to bed. Okay? And then we complement this with a lot of other interviews. I have a very long health and well-being interview. It's the very last thing in the project. At the end of it, I get people to go through their medicine chests, their refrigerators, what foods they have. Okay, so that's what we do. And so there's a lot of data associated with this project. And the approach to health that I'm trying to take here is a little bit different than what you see in a lot of the literature. A lot of the literature that's been done in the U.S. focuses on health as an individual concern, as sort of a personal matter. And what my approach is trying to look at is what health means in everyday family context. And so what this means is I don't predefine health as circumscribed to this notion of personal well-being, although I don't say that's unimportant, but what I try and do is I try and look for visions of health that extend into the social world, and in particularly a notion of health as family well-being. And so I find that it's linked up to things the things that parents are presently concerned about, their aspirations for the future. It's bound up with relationships with other people. And what I try and do is I try and look for clues in the video recordings and the interview data that illuminate connections between what matters to family members and how matters of health enter into family life. And so we learn a lot, for example, about family life and raising a family when you look through this lens of health. You see the extent to which matters of health and well-being are matters of concern within the often hectic lives of these families. You have a sense of, what are the connections between what people say is important and what happens in the press of everyday life. And basically what I've been looking for is how we can see this sort of the contours of this socially embedded and relational view of health and how it takes different shapes and intertwines with health as an individual concern. And I find that this is a family-by-family process. And so I find that I have to actually spend a lot of time with each family. And just to give you a sense of some of this, so for example, in one of the families, we see how the father's smoking, and he actually works very hard to keep it out of family view. But it was seen by the mother and other people in the family to corrosively threaten the foundations of family well-being, not just his own personal health, whereas in another family, the father's smoking was seen to play a positive role in maintaining a rather precarious financial and emotional family equilibrium. So even though it was seen to impact on his health at a personal level, the wife in particular was very concerned that he might stop smoking and it would actually threaten the family well-being. It's actually very complicated. Okay, so next week, because I'm only here for a month, I'll present a colloquium next week, and I'm just going to present data from a couple of families to give you a sense of this complex relation between health as talk and health as enacted in family life. Thank you.
Well, that's your buffet. Now, all you need to do is go to the SAR website and look on the calendar, and you'll know when each one of these fellows is presenting their weekly colloquium, and you can come back and join. Thank you so much.